Hi and welcome back to another weekly Ask GMBN Tech. This is our Q&A session all about bike tech. If you've got any questions, get involved in the comments, use the hashtag Ask GMBN Tech. This week is all about hardtails. We've had loads of questions, so let's get cracking, shall we? Right, first question coming up on screen right now is from Matthias. He says, which tyre is best for bike parks on a hardtail? And do you recommend to have an insert perhaps just on the back wheel? Okay, well, the first thing to say about bike parks is you don't always necessarily need something with the most amount of traction because the surfaces are designed for riding on. You can have lots of bank turns like berms, things like that to help support you. So you could take advantage of that and have something that rolls a bit quicker. However, bike parks also suggest a bit of a playful nature, and on a hardtail, you're going to be giving a bit more stick to that back end of the bike. So my advice actually, instead of going for the faster tyre with less knobbles, go for something a bit burlier. The more rubber that's on that tyre, the more protection you're going to have, and you need that on the back end. Now with the inserts, yeah, I would definitely recommend an insert of some kind on the rear wheel, especially if you really need to get a bit more traction, you want to lower the pressure, because then you are subject to splitting the tyre, pinch punctures, even damaging your rims. Now there's various different types of inserts you can opt for. There's the basic style ones which are more like a foam, like Vittoria make those. There's the New Privard system, there's Rimpact. There's a number of these on the market available to you, and they all work really well. But they're very different in operation to Cushcore and the way that they operate. So all of the foam ones are great. They will definitely help give you protection against that. Some of them, like the Vittoria one, that actually take up a big space in the tyre. You can ride the tyre flat, i.e. to get to the bottom of a race run, something like that. But they're not gonna, none of those are gonna give you the same effect as a Cushcore. Now Cushcore helps effectively clamp the tyre onto the rim. Now this actually might be a good thing for the back end of a hardtail. Now there is a premium for these because they do cost quite a lot, and despite what they tell you about how quick and easy they are to fit, it's not always the case. Some tyre and rim combinations can be a little bit more stubborn. It's going to be fine to do at home in your workshop or in your garden, but maybe not so at the side of the trail when you do have a problem. So the Cushcore system, all right, so it clamps the tyre on, but it also acts as a bit of an air volume spacer for your tyres. This in itself could make a really good thing, in addition to the fact it helps protect your rim, it helps basically give you that air volume sort of buffer, if you want to call it that, in the tyre, and also it's going to help protect your tyre. So my combo would be to go for a chunkier tyre on the rear. I'd also go for a tyre insert like a Cushcore, and I'd be inclined as well to have, if you're literally just want to hammer bike parks, go for a thicker tyre, something like an enduro casing tyre or a downhill casing tyre that are often well, in rarity you could get a 4-ply, but that might be slight overkill. Just something a bit bigger that's going to withstand use and without you having to run it at like 50 psi, because that's just going to be no fun. You want to get the traction at the back end and look after your tyres. I think that's about it really. Now as far as actual tyres go, it's entirely up to you. If you're going for Maxxis, if you want to get a bit of extra protection on the back end, look at a DHF, but put it on the rear. So that's the front tyre, and the knobbles on the top actually are quite flat and long. They're great when your rear wheel is going to be locking up more on a hardtail because it skips across the ground. They're a bit more resistant than something like a DHR, which is their rear tyre. So the DHF on the rear is actually a good shout for a hardtail. If you want to do Vittoria, a similar tyre is the Mazza. A little bit more advanced, arguably, because it's got a few more features on it. And again, they do that in different casings and different sizes. They even do a 2.6, so that might actually be a pretty good shout for a hardtail. But you might want to ignore this and go for the faster rolling tyre route, in which case something like an Ardent by Maxxis, even a Rock Razor by Schwalbe, or what would you run in terms of Vittoria? I'd go for an Agaro probably. That's what I like to run on the rear. I guess it's fairly similar in style of tyre to an Ardent. Hopefully that's not too much of a long answer for you. Okay, next up is from Super Pigolot. What is the main advantage to a full suspension mountain bike compared to a hardtail, and what would you recommend? Well, in reverse, I'd recommend people to be able to ride both bikes, and in an ideal way you would start on a hardtail and you progress to a full suspension bike, and then of course if you want to go back to a hardtail, whatever. And the reason I say that is hardtails are not forgiving. If you make a mistake on a hardtail, it's completely exposed and you're going to suffer for it, or your equipment will suffer from it. So that alone teaches you good form. At least teaches you like good etiquette on the bike, because of the fact that you have to ride with good technique. Now full suspension is incredible. I'm a complete convert and I wouldn't want anything else, but I have spent many years on a hardtail bike previously, and I still ride a hardtail here and there, because of the fact that if you learn everything on a full suspension bike, yeah, great, you're going to be a good rider. No problems there at all, and don't take this as a you absolutely should. I just think it's a good idea to ride a hardtail, because if you're to learn everything on a full suspension bike, to a degree you kind of rely on the ability that full suspension offers you, and to a degree you could arguably say you get a bit lazy. The same could be said with riding clips and flats. If you were to ride clipless pedals all the time, your technique could get a bit lazy. You're relying on the pedals to lift the bike around rather than correct technique, which you would learn on flat pedals. Same could be said with full suspension to hardtail. So a full suspension is always going to cover ground better, because the primary function of suspension is to allow the wheels to track the ground to give you grip and traction. Comfort is an added bonus, be able to jump off stuff and not feel it so much. Again, it's an added bonus, but the function of suspension is to keep those wheels tracking the ground, of which a hardtail just simply cannot compete with. No matter what the most hardcore hardtail convert will tell you, they don't cover ground as well as a full suspension bike, but they can be way more fun. I'm a huge hardtail fan. Like I said, I believe everyone should ride a hardtail. Like I said, you know, full suspension is going to allow you to ride gnarlier trails faster, easier to a degree, but there's not much more than a hardtail can't do. A hardtail can take on anything if the geometry is correct and you're a good rider. I mean, there's some shots of Blake on screen riding his hardtail at the Mega Avalanche, which no doubt I'm going to refer to again later in this video. And that is about as brutal as you could possibly get on a hardtail. Now, for that ride in particular, Blake essentially put a bigger travel front fork on the bike, which wasn't necessarily recommended by the manufacturer, but in this case it was kind of right as a one-off. He put downhill spec wheels on there, he had inserts in the tyres, downhill tyres with super thick casing in them, and weirdly you would think that it might be his hands that hurt. Okay, so he's running a RockShox Lyric. I think he had 170mm travel on the front for this race. Some more shots of the bike itself. There should be statics that I took actually. So you can see here that the bike is very, very slack. But you'd think riding something as aggressive as a Mega Avalanche, you'd get really sore hands, but it's actually Blake's legs that suffered. Now, Blake's a super strong guy. Now, any of you that have met him will know this. But the thing that Blake wasn't bargaining for is just how effective a suspension bike is, and this kind of illustrates my point. He could ride down a Mega Avalanche, no problem. He could overtake people on the hardtail, no problem, and I'm sure many of you could do the same. But it's a fatigue that full suspension bike lets you get around that you cannot make up for on a hardtail. So what he was finding was his legs were in absolute agony, because he basically had to do the entire race stood up. So he was getting cramping in his thighs. I think his glutes were really hurting. Like, his legs were absolutely beasted by the time we got to the bottom, because any chance of any let up on a suspension bike, when you're maybe on the more rolling terrain, you can get back in the saddle and let the suspension take the work, and you can just sort of, you probably don't even notice this, but you are recovering as you're doing this. He can do it on a hardtail, because every time he sat down, he was getting kicked off the saddle and all over the place. So his legs are tense the entire ride. And that's something you will never get back on a hardtail. But fair play to him for doing it on a hardtail, and fair play to any of you for doing riding hardcore as that on a hardtail. They're brilliant. Everyone should ride one at some point. Okay, next question is from Cameron Lindsay. What things do you need to consider when converting a budget hardtail from 2x to 1x? I'm not too bothered about the gearing ratios, but just on the practical side of things. Okay, so if you're going to do this on the absolute cheapest basis, there's really a single thing you're going to need. You'll need a chainring and some spacers, or an offset chainring. The reason you need to do that is your bike currently has two chainrings. If you were to just take one off and run the chain this side, it's two spaced this way, and vice versa with the other one. You need the chainring to be essentially in the middle of where those two are, like it would be with the dedicated 1x chain set. Now, that's easily done. You can do this thing, but you do need to take into account the chainring size that you're going to put on the bike, because of the fact that your bike, if it's got derailleur gears on it, assuming it has with a 2x on the front there, it will be designed around clearance for multiple chainrings, not a single, which tends to sit closer to the chainstay. Quite often the biggest you can get is a 32. I've got a 34 on most of my bikes, and it's very close to the chainstays, and that's on bikes that it's designed for. So that is something you definitely need to sort of try it before you ride it to see how close you can get. You can get an educated guess by measuring, but you want to make sure you have enough clearance there. Now, the chainring that you buy will need to be a narrow wide profile if this is the only thing you're buying, because that does help keep the chain on. Your other option is to get a small chain guide on the top, and it wouldn't be a bad idea anyway. Well, you said on the hardtail, any chance possible to remove the chain from the ability to be able to jump off is a good thing. And if you're only changing the chainring, then a tiny little chain guide on top could be good. There's a number of small options on the market. I've got one here, this sort of thing from Nukeproof. Great value, very, very simple, nearly invisible on the bike, doesn't weigh anything at all, and that will stop your chain coming off. And of course, the next thing would be to consider a clutch derailleur. And of course, then you're a whole new realm. In fact, I'm going to throw a video link in the description underneath where I did a bit of an experiment on narrow wide chain rings and clutch derailleurs. So I rode with a narrow wide and a clutch. I rode the narrow wide with a clutch off. I rode a regular chain ring with clutch off and with clutch on. So there's like 4 different combinations there. And I was on a full suspension bike, so it will be accentuated on a hardtail. So if you imagine watching that video, when the chain would come off, it would come off a lot faster on a hardtail. And that's about it, really. I guess you could take the opportunity to replace your bottom bracket or the bearings if they needed doing at the same time. And you might want to consider, given the cost of some chain rings, you could get yourself a budget 1x crank with a chainring already on there. Again, check the clearance, and if you're unsure, just pop to your local bike shop and hopefully they will set you straight. Okay, next question's from Peter. I ride a 2012 26-inch wheel Ghost EBS comp hardtail with a 100mm entry-level fork that now needs to be replaced. I wonder if I could stick a 120mm fork on there. Does it really affect the stability and climbability of the bike that remarkably much, since as BB sits higher? I really don't want to sacrifice anything in the climbs and be unstable in the downhills. Hopefully you can help me out with that decision. Okay, so I'd say on any bike, no matter what the travel, 20mm increase would be the absolute max that you should go, because you can risk really ruining the handling of the bike, unless that bike had adjustable geometry so you could compensate somewhere, but it doesn't sound like your bike has anything like that. So going from 100 to 120, now something you need to know, if you go up 10mm travel, you can potentially reduce your head angle by degrees. So you could take 2 degrees off the head angle of your bike if the fork was to be 20mm taller. Now this isn't always the case. Some forks, you measure a 100mm fork, you measure a 120mm fork. The 120mm fork will be 20mm taller, but this doesn't always apply. This is where you need to do a little bit of homework and look for what's known as the axle to crown measurement. Okay, so this is going to be key in the handling of your bike, regardless of the travel that you're putting on there. It's common information, you can get it from all major manufacturers. You can measure it yourself. It's from the center of the axle to literally where the crown race sits on the crown. That is your axle to crown measurement, okay? Now you want yours to be as close as possible. You certainly don't want it to be less, because you're steep in your head angle. Now I'd say you want it to be less than 20mm higher, regardless of the travel you want to go for. 110mm would be the optimum compromise for this, really, to safeguard yourself, because of the fact you could be adding 20mm height to the front of the bike. But just as a good example here, I've got a Cannondale Lefty Ocho somewhere in here, is 100mm travel. They've just released a 120mm travel one, and when I looked at the axle to crown measurements on them, it's only about 3 or 4mm longer. So it's not 20mm longer, it's just the fork is a slightly different configuration, but it fits on the same style bike, so you can have more travel on there. So not that you would necessarily want to be looking at that if you've got like a more entry-level bike, because that's an extremely expensive fork, and you're also going to need a wheel to go along with that. But the point is, it's not always case in point with these sort of things, so do check the axle to crown measurement. Now, something to bear in mind, that if it was 20mm taller, the fork that you're looking at getting, whatever brand it is, you're potentially taking off 2 degrees off your head angle, your bottom bracket is going to get higher, and your seat angle is going to get higher, slacker. Okay, so also technically the reach of your bike decreases. So the higher the front end goes on your bike, this is from the fork, not necessarily from the bars, your reach will get shorter. All right, so you're gonna have to compensate for that by putting your stem down slightly, maybe rolling your bars forwards. And as far as your climbing position goes, because your seat angle comes back slightly, you're gonna need to move your saddle forward and down slightly to retain a similar position on the bike. It's possible to do it, it's not too much of an issue. But like I said, check the axle to crown measurements. That is the key information you want in this. Now, one extra little bit of information on this is, bearing in mind the longer fork travel you have, when you set the fork up with sag, you can actually return it to a similar height. Bearing in mind that longer fork has technically a larger amount of sag compared to the short fork, even if it's the same percentage, yeah? So it might just be possible that a 120mm fork with 30% sag is only gonna be a fraction higher than your 100mm fork with 30% sag. Again, check your axle to crown measurements and hopefully it'll work out for you. Next up's from Avril Shields, cool name. Me and a friend have bought the same 29 hardtail. Mine's a small, his is a large. This makes angles on my bike seem a lot more aggressive than his. Is this just something that happens with lower end bikes, or does it happen with higher end bikes too? Have you ever noticed this? Are you suggesting that the geometry on your bikes that are actually the same model are different because of sizing? I find that a bit strange. I guess it could be possible. If that is the case, confirm it in the comments. I think you might be referring to how it looks with the radically sloping top tube, and it might accentuate parts of the geometry that don't look as obvious on the bigger one. I think that's probably the case. You can get some bikes that have size specific geometry, which would mean basically on a smaller size bike you would have a slightly shorter chainstay. On a larger size bike you'd have a slightly longer chainstay, and the same, the front end of the bike will be longer on the bigger bike, and it'll be shorter on the shorter bike. Seat angle as well tends to change because you think the height that a shorter rider has a saddle, you're more neutral, you're more central on the bike. The taller you put the saddle up, if the saddle angle is slacker, the further towards the rear wheel that saddle goes. So on a larger bike, typically you'll see, well, you're starting to see the seat angle get steeper on them proportionally to keep the saddle effectively in the same position as it would be on the smaller bike. But they're really the only difference, and it's just kind of marginal things that just grow as the bike gets bigger essentially. But I can't imagine anything's actually that different here, as I think it's probably just how extreme it might look with the sloping top tube and the short seat tube and things on your bike. But I'm interested. You didn't say what the bikes are. Let us know in those comments. Next up is over to Jim Wade. I'm looking for a new bike, an aggressive hardtail, and I preferably want 27.5 as I'm coming from 26, but most seem to be 29ers. I'm worried that 26 to 29 might be too big of a jump, and it might be too big from what I'm used to. For reference, I'm 6 foot tall, if that makes a difference. Well, to be honest with your height, a 29er is ideal, but don't let that sway you. You still got to pick what suits you. So the first thing is you need to know is when 29-inch wheels first came out in the market, there wasn't 27.5. So you're going through what people did back then. The jump from 26 to 29, everyone's like, oh my God, like, look at the difference, it's day and night different. And it is. The jump up to 27.5, really, I think it's almost less than an inch. It's barely anything if you actually look at the measurements with the same equivalent tyres on a bike. So you won't even notice that much difference on the bike. But the jump to 29, you'll definitely notice some differences. Now on a hardtail, I actually think 29ers can really improve the ride. They can give you more contact patch, you get a bit more grip. They're less affected by surface conditions as a smaller wheel bike would be. And of course, the fact that the bigger wheel is slightly more stable, which is a good thing, but that might not be what you want. 27.5 offers some great traits. You could upsize the tyre so you get a bit more rollover, a bit more cushioning, and still have the benefits of the smaller wheel. So it's kind of difficult because they're both great choices. Now, don't let anyone tell you one is better than the other. They both have their advantages, okay? But I do think that 29ers do have slightly more advantages in hardtail terms, just because of what they can offer a bike with no suspension on the rear. Best thing really is to try if you can. Trying a bike isn't always possible for everyone, but if you can get yourself to a demo of some kind, of course lockdown and stuff has kind of ruined all this stuff, but it's the best opportunity if you're not sure, is to try. Preferably two models of the same bike, one with 29 wheels, one with 27.5, and ride your existing bike on the same trail that you're going to test them on. That's the best way to get a bit of honest feedback. So you'll note some areas where your bike feels especially good and maybe where it doesn't feel so good through rough stuff. Then make the same comparisons on the other two bikes, and good luck with that basically. And if anyone wants to help you out in the comments underneath with recent purchases they might have made, if they were making a similar struggle, please do in the comments underneath. It's always good for everyone to help each other out here. Okay, next question is from Sick MTB Stuff. Doddy, I was wondering if it's worth putting a dropper post on my hardtail. Note, I've got internally routed cables, but I don't have a hole for an internal drop post, so I have to run it externally. Well, yes, just get one. Just get on with it. Externally routed, yes, that is a slight annoyance, given the fact that you've got internal routing. Are you sure there's definitely not a route that you could follow on your bike? Have you actually checked that out? Have you contacted the manufacturer of your bike to see if there's any routing internally that you can get to it? It's worth a try. Of course, some people, I would never recommend this, but some people have drilled out holes for drop posts before. If anyone's done that, they can pick that up in a comment, but the bottom line is you'll ruin your warranty, you could damage your frame could break. There's a number of things, shouldn't need to spell that out, but I know plenty of people that have actually done this and it's been fine for them. But that said, externally routed isn't the end of the world, and a dropper post will transform everything, because you can feel like a jump bike or a downhill bike, and it can feel like an XC bike in one just by pushing a button. They're amazing. Don't even question it, just get one. Get the best one you can and have fun on it. Next question is about hardtails for cross country. So how do I know if my hardtail is made for cross country or trail? Typically it's about the geometry and amount of suspension travel on there. So typically a hardtail cross country bike will be extremely light. Even a budget one will be lighter than the same equivalent in a trail bike, and it will have a maximum of 100mm travel fork. So the regular seems to be 80mm up to 100mm of travel. Now for XC, they tend to have skinnier, faster rolling tyres. They tend to have 29-inch wheels now. It's generally accepted on cross-country bikes that it's the better thing, because the thing with cross-country bikes is they need to be light and they need to cover ground as fast as possible. They're not about the same things as a trail hardtail would be, in which case quite often you get a choice on a trail bikes of having 27.5 or 29. Sometimes size specific, sometimes if the bike's a bit more aggressive, it might have the smaller wheels and a really raked out head angle on the front there. Trail bikes then, as a direct comparison, tend to have 120mm travel upwards. I would say 120 to 130 for a trail bike. Any more than that, it starts getting into a proper aggressive hardtail territory, which of course you could ride one of those for cross country if you wanted to, but you could also enter a downhill race on one because of what they're intended for. They tend to have mixed wheel sizes, alloy or steel frames, whereas on the cross-country bikes it tends to be alloy and carbon on the more expensive ones. That's about it really. Is your bike super light? Has it got a short travel fork? Does it look racy? Then it probably is a cross-country bike. If it looks a bit more playful, a bit slacker, a bit more travel on the front, then it's probably a trail bike. Next is from C. Sneesby. My hardtail came stock with a 130mm fork, and I've now got a 160 for it, but I'm considering a 180mm RockShox Zeb. What's your opinion? Do you think this would be okay? All right, well, technically not, but it totally depends on the bike that you're riding. Some bikes have a big range of travel forks they're compatible with. Certainly some of the more progressive frames, Kona Honzos, not Onzas. Yeah, the Kona Honzo frame, the ESD in particular, Marin, I've totally forgotten the name of their brand new hardtail, the Elroy. Yeah, that one. There's a number of those out there that you can run long travel forks on there. But if it's a standard hardtail, and it, as you say, came with a 130mm fork, I think 160 is pushing it, mate. I think running it to 180 could rake it out too much, bump up that BB. Don't know. At worst case, you could snap your head tube off. Think about it, like what can happen if you just land a jump to flat on a hardtail. If it's really raked out, you want to avoid that at all costs. Anyone else out there put a fork as big as a 180mm fork on a hardtail? I know Blake did it on his one, but he did check he ran a 170 over the 140 that it came with stock, so he was going pretty hardcore on that. But he did run it a fair bit of sag on that and had the damping to compensate for that. But interested to know. I would avoid going any bigger. I think 160 is pushing it, to be honest. Hopefully there's some good hardtail answers for you. Got any questions about any of the questions on this show? Let us know in the comments, and we'll see you next week. See you later.